Thank you, Mr. President. Over the last 2.5 years of this administration, we have seen an incredible situation when it comes to immigration and our border. We have seen, unfortunately, some of the saddest and most heartbreaking scenes involving children at the border of the United States with Mexico. The pattern started with the President's announcement shortly after he was sworn in that he was imposing a travel ban on Muslim countries. That created chaos at our airports and continues to separate thousands of American families. Then the President stepped up and repealed DACA, the executive order program created by President Obama, which allowed almost 800,000 young immigrants to stay in this country without fear of deportation and to make a life in the only country many of them had ever known. Then the President announced the termination of the Temporary Protected Status Program, a program which we offered and have throughout our history, modern history, for those who are facing oppression or natural disaster in their countries. President Trump announced he was going to terminate it, affecting the lives of 300,000 immigrants. Then came the disastrous separation of thousands of families at the border. 2,880 infants, toddlers, and children separated from their parents by the government of the United States. This zero-tolerance policy finally was reversed by President Trump after the public outcry against it. Then what followed was the longest government shutdown in history over the President's demand that he was going to build a border wall, even at the cost of shutting down the government of the United States for 5 weeks. What followed were the tragic deaths of 6 children apprehended at the border and 24 people in detention facilities of the United States. The President then announced that he was going to block all assistance to the Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the source of most of the immigrants who come to our border, and that he would shut down avenues for legal migration, driving even more refugees to our border. Now, on President Trump's watch, we have an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. We have seen that crisis exemplified by the horrifying image of Oscar Alberto Martinez Ramirez and his 23-month-old daughter, Valeria, who fled El Salvador and drowned as they tried to cross the Rio Grande 2 weeks ago. We've seen this crisis play out in the overcrowded and inhumane conditions at detention centers at the border. In April, I visited El Paso, Texas. What I saw in the Border Patrol's overcrowded facilities was heartbreaking. In May, I led 24 senators in calling for the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security to investigate our border control facilities. Mr. President, I never dreamed that I would be asking the International Red Cross to investigate detention facilities in the United States. They do that, but usually you're asking them to look into some third world country where inhumane conditions are being alleged. After being at El Paso and after seeing what's going on our border, I joined with 23 other senators asking the International Red Cross to investigate the United States detention facilities. Later that same month, the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security released a report detailing the inhumane and dangerous overcrowding of migrants at the El Paso port of entry. The Inspector General's office found the overcrowding was, quote, an immediate risk to the health and safety of detainees and DHS employees. 1 week ago, the Inspector General's office issued another scathing report, this time about multiple Border Patrol facilities in the Rio Grande Valley. The Inspector General's office asked the Department of Homeland Security to take immediate steps to alleviate dangerous overcrowding and prolonged detention. And they stated, quote, we are concerned that overcrowding and prolonged detention represent an immediate risk to the health and safety of DHS agents and officers and to those detained. Congress recently passed legislation 2 weeks ago, which included $793 million in funding to alleviate overcrowding at these CBP facilities, and other funding to provide food, supplies, medical care to migrants. The bill also includes critical funding for the Office of Refugee Resettlement to care for migrant children. We must now make sure that this money is spent effectively by the Trump administration. We gave them over $400 million in February, and they came back to us within 90 days and said, we're out of money. I'd like to know how they're spending this money, and I want to make sure it's being spent where it's needed. There is a gaping leadership vacuum at the Trump administration's Department of Homeland Security. Think of this. In 2.5 years, there have already been 4 different people serving as head of that department. Every position in the Department of Homeland Security with responsibility for immigration or border security is now being held by a temporary appointee, and the White House refuses to even submit nominations to fill these positions. 2 weeks ago, I met with Mark Morgan, one of these temporary appointees. In May, President Trump named him acting director of U.S. Immigration Customs Enforcement. Mr. Morgan was asked at that time to carry out the mass arrests and mass deportations of millions of immigrants that the president had threatened by his infamous tweets. Shortly before I met with Mr. Morgan to ask him about the mass arrest and mass deportations, there was a change. They took him out of that position and named him as acting director of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. He went from internal enforcement to border enforcement. So now he's in charge of solving the humanitarian crisis that President Trump has created at our border. The Trump administration can shuffle the deck chairs on this Titanic, but we must acknowledge the obvious. President Trump's immigration and border security policies have failed. Tough talk isn't enough. We need to do better. This morning I had Dr. Goza. She is the president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. She came to give me a report about her visit to several border facilities that's been well documented and reported in the press. It was hard for her, she said, to see these things as a doctor for children and realize they were happening in the United States. Yes, children are being held in caged facilities with wire fences and watchtowers around them, some of them very young children. And she told me as a pediatrician, those things have an impact on a child, how that child looks at the world, how that child looks at himself. She said she took a lot of notes as she went through these facilities, but it wasn't until she got on the airplane on the way home and read through them. She said, then I started crying. I'm supposed to be a professional who can take this, but I couldn't imagine what we were doing to these children at the border. And there just aren't enough medical professionals there, not nearly enough. The United States is better than that. We can do better than that. We can have a secure border and respect our international obligations to provide a safe haven to those who are fleeing persecution, as we've done on a bipartisan basis, Democrats and Republicans, for decades. I stand ready, and I believe my party stands ready, to work with Republicans on smart, effective, and humane solutions to the crisis at our border. I would suggest the following be included. Crack down on traffickers that are exploiting immigrants. That's unacceptable. Assistance to stabilize the Northern Triangle countries. That's long overdue. In-country processing and third-country resettlement so that migrants can seek safe haven under our laws without making the dangerous and expensive trek to our border. Eliminate the immigration court backlog so that asylum claims can be processed more quickly. Mr. President, you know we authorized 100 more immigration court judges, and this administration can't find people to fill them. They want more judges. They've got authority to hire 100 more. They've been unable to do it. And we need to ensure that children and families are treated humanely when they are in the custody of the United States government. Eventually, the history of this period will be written, and there will be accountability, not just for the officials in government, but for all of us, those of us in the Senate and the House, and those in journalism, other places. We're going to have to answer for the way that these people have been treated. Whether or not they qualify for legal status in the United States, I hope we can hold our heads up high and say that at least from this point forward, we're going to show them that we are a humane and caring people. No matter where you come from, no matter how poor you may be, we will take care that children are treated in a merciful way, in a compassionate way, that the adults are given appropriate opportunities to exercise whatever rights they have under the laws of our country, and that at the end of the day we can hold our heads high that we've done this in a fashion consistent with the values of the United States of America. We haven't seen that yet. It's time for the President to acknowledge that get tough, bizarre tweets just aren't enough. We've got to have a policy that makes sense to bring stability to our border. Mr. President, I yield the floor.